Hello, Checker car enthusiasts. This is the Checker Motors car factory where most of it all happened. In 1923, Morris Markin, who immigrated from Russia and became the president of a small auto company named Checker, moved his production facility from Joliet, Illinois to Kalamazoo, Michigan. For 60 years, the taxi cabs and cars that were produced here were recognized as the best in the industry. This is the long-awaited video that contains two very important parts of the Checker Car Club of America's national meet in June of 2002. The first part of this video shows the historical lecture given by the club's vice president, Mike Angelic. Checker Motors certainly has a fascinating history. The second part includes footage of the old Checker cars that were at the national meet last June. This was the first time that the best examples of the few remaining pre-1960 Checker cars had ever been gathered in one place. A lot of work has been put into preparing this video. Though we're not professionals and it's not perfect, still we did the best we could. We hope you enjoy it. It begins a few seconds into the lecture. When Mike says the lecture begins at 8:30, you'd better have your camera rolling.
We'll talk on some Checker history. Mechanical things, I'm not going to go into what carburetor was used in a 688. It's basically going to be about Checker's history before 1923, and then we're going to go into some really like odd stuff. I want to go into the stuff no one knows, but hopefully you can all learn something tonight and have a little fun. I want to talk about the ambulances, the buses, some of the odd things, the passenger cars they made, and maybe this will be a little different than the usual stuff you've read in magazines. And I also want to go into some falsehoods, because in doing a lot of research, magazines, television, and some other things, I found lots and lots of misinformation out there. Tons of it. I mean, to the point of being like ridiculous stuff that's like made up. And I just want to try to get to the truth, and maybe we can, see what really happened in some of these cases. Not what sounded good and look good and this type of thing, or what some guy might have put together some magazine article in 10 minutes and said, you know what, this looks really good, that sounds good, let's just throw this in and make this all up. So basically, we're going to start with the way Checker originated and where it all came from. Checker started in 1902 as a spark plug. There was a guy named William Shaw. He was an engineer in Buffalo, New York, and he made a lot of money on inventing a spark plug. And automotive engineering and cars were pretty new at that time. And he decided to take that money and go into the automobile business. And in doing so, he came out with this car. It actually was this car right here. It was a buggy. It was called the Dijon. I guess he thought Dijon would sound better because it was French. Because in those days, French cars were really like a high-end car, like the Renaults and the Dantons, and the cars that just importing to this country were really high-end cars. And it just, I guess, sounded a lot better. So now all of a sudden, William Shaw became Dijon, and he put out this buggy that sold for about, $600, and it was really just a modified buggy, from horse and wagon days. It wasn't a true car. But he was the kind of guy that, I get the feeling, was kind of a hustler. So he wanted to move on to bigger and better things. So he outgrew his small garage in Buffalo, New York, and his company settled on Buffaloes. He moved, or wanted to move, to Cornell, New York, which is New York's southern tier, and go on with his company. So he formed the Dijon Cornell Motor Company, and apparently there was some kind of hassle with the contractor when they were building the building. And now we're up to 1909. The first car was built in 1907. 1909, he wanted to move to Hornell, New York, and the plant wasn't done. He got into some kind of fight with the contractor. He walked off the job and ended up in Ecorse, Michigan. And there, he changed the name again to the Deschamps Motor Car Company of Detroit. And from what I gather, Ecorse, Michigan was like a model industrial community. It was the kind of community where you had the workers lived over here and the factory was here, and it was all an engineered community, kind of like, you know, today Herndon or Reston, Virginia, or some of those type of communities. And it was like a fashionable thing. It was called the Suburban Village, and they were going to set up this ideal little living environment. And in doing so, they also named the car the Suburban. So, you know, that was this car here. It's interesting there was an A4, which later became a checker model also. But apparently, you know, Deschamps' hustling like overtook what reality was in this particular car. He wrote a check for $150,000, and at the time he had $150 in his bank account. So that kind of all went south, and he kind of disappeared. So this whole idea kind of fizzled. He went off and died shortly afterwards. He was involved in developing some kind of motorcycle. A fellow named Palmer came in and entered the scene and put up some money, and they were going to produce a car called a Palmer, but he didn't have a lot of marketing ability, so he actually went in with this guy called Parton, who had a distributorship of cars and things. So the car became, we're up to about 1913, and you had Parton, the distributor, Palmer, the manufacturer, and then he kind of produced this thing. And again, by 1915, these guys, I guess, didn't make a very good car. They weren't very good businessmen. They were bankrupt. A guy in Chicago steps into the picture, a guy named George J. Whitcomb and Company, and he puts up a lot of money, and he moves them out of there, and all of a sudden, they end up in Rochelle, Illinois. And in this, they end up with the Commonwealth car. We're up to 1915. The Commonwealth was actually put into place. They started actually doing pretty good. They ended up in Joliet, Illinois, and they took over a factory that was producing a stationary engine called Quail and a farm tractor called the Thoroughbred. And they had this car going. It was a fairly strong car. And the car's claim to fame is that it had a super strong frame. That somebody had this indestructible frame, and the car could really take a beating. Well, now we're up to 1920. The Commonwealth Motor Company is sitting in Joliet, Illinois. Something important happened. They capitalized the company. They went public and they got $6 million in cash. And they had plans to really go and move on with this company. And another thing happened. The Checker Taxi Cab Company of Chicago was formed. And Checker Taxi needed cars. Now this is where Checker, as we know it, got its name. Checker Taxi was an operating company. A group of independent, formed a co-op of taxi owners, and they were looking for a strong car. They were from Chicago. In Joliet, which is right in their backyard. This is the car that came a year later, but they wanted a really strong car. And that's where Checker got its name. But what's funny is, Checker didn't get its name right away. It was Checker Operating Company. And Checker Taxi owned the company. They wanted someone to make a car for them. Commonwealth was one of several vendors. You also had Templar, from Cleveland who was selling cars, and you also had Elcar from Elcar, Indiana, who was selling them cars. So it's a contrary to popular belief. The checkerboard was used on all of these cars, and this was owned by the operating company in Chicago. They were starting to sell a lot of cars, and actually the car they were selling was called a Mogul, M-O-G-U-L. That was the taxi cab version of what they were selling. However, in those days, the taxi cab body was called purpose-built. Purpose-built meant everything basically from here back was added on later by a bodybuilder. It was specially made, the way a truck body works today. Here's the cab, here's the cab and chassis, here's the body. Enter Morris Market. Man we know, this man who founded and owned basically Checker. There was a guy in that area, in Joliet also, this guy named Lomberg. No one seems to ever know this guy's first name. I've never tried, no one seems to know. Just Lomberg, a fellow named Lomberg, apparently needed $15,000. Why he needed it, he was on the edge of going out of business or whatever. Morris Market was flush with cash. He made a lot of money selling pans during World War I to the Army, and he had this money. He stepped in, loaned the guy. The guy apparently got in more trouble. He's got to make these bodies. And Market stepped in. He needed another loan. He says, no, no good. You know, you're not like any kind of businessman. I'm taking over the company. Voila. Morris Market was now from the pants business in the taxi cab business. And this is the way he got in. He got in by building those bodies. And they started out, they were basically called Templars. They had Herschel Spillman engines in them. These were engines were basically, they were made in Buffalo. Herschel Spillman also made carousels, you know, most of those wooden carousels you see out there, you know, today in a lot of museums and stuff, were also made by Herschel Spillman. What happened, in 1921, they came out with this car, which is called the C. And that was really the first Commonwealth car that was put out as a cab, and it was basically used in Chicago. So what had happened, in 1921, a lot of other stuff started to happen. Morris Market brought in a pretty predominant car designer called Leonard Goodspeed, who was really, he was working for a company here in Kalamazoo called Romer, who was making a taxi cab called a Pennant. There's another fellow that was real significant in his company too, Jim Stout. He also worked there, and he came in at a later date. So these guys had experience making taxi cabs. Checker got in some problems because at that time, and I'll talk about this later, they were trying to market a car called the Goodspeed, which was a really high-end pleasure car that sold for a lot of money. I mean, at the time, these were selling for around $2,000. The Goodspeed was selling for $5,000 and change. So it was a really high-end car. And they were going to go off and manufacture these private cars also. Apparently, they got in trouble. Before this, though, this gets a little complicated. Checker, Commonwealth and Market Auto Body merged. The Goodspeed deal with the Goodspeed car got them in a little trouble. They went bankrupt. It was time to reorganize. They reorganized the company, and at this point, all the people from Commonwealth were gone. Morris Market now had control with a group of his investors of Commonwealth. So that's where 1922 takes us. They start making a car in Joliet called an H. Now they were making the frame and chassis and the body. They were making the whole car. They were making it mostly for Checker in Chicago. There was a company called Becker, Weiss, and Polanski. There was people that marketed taxi cabs in New York City. These guys and Market got together, and they realized they could sell cars in the biggest market in the country, which was New York City. And he was going to market for them. He was going to say, I'll take your cars and market it as the Mogul. That's what they did. All of a sudden, he got the rights to use the name. Actually, that was a little later on. But what he did is, let's take these cars, move them out of the Chicago area. Let's give up the passenger cars. Let's make taxi cabs, and let's start selling them in the major cities. So that's what they did. They ended up with a huge market. Henry Weiss would turn out to be one of the largest cab marketing guys ever. He ended up doing all kinds of stuff much later on in New York City, and he really started selling these cars, and they couldn't keep up with demand. They were in a small place in Joliet, and they said it's time to move. And that's when they moved. In April of 23, they moved from here. And they bought out, it was a factory, they got the Dort Body Company, and they got the Hanley Knight factory on Pitcher. And they took over these existing factories, and Dort was for the bodies, the Hanley Knight was where they were going to make the cars, because in those days these bodies had to all be hand painted, and it took a lot of time, the drying time, and they were mostly made out of wood, and it took a real long time to put these cars together. So they started doing that, and this is an oddity I found out somewhere. Actually, Terry Voigt helped me with this. We looked around, and I could never understand why Mills Prawn Irish from Indianapolis was making checker cabs using Mills Prawn Irish body. Why were they making bodies for Checker when Checker owned the Market Auto Body Company and they made their own bodies? But what happened when they moved from Joliet to Kalamazoo? It took a long time to get the plant online. So they used Mills Prawn Irish, who actually made most of the cab bodies at that time. Here's an ad where they did Dodge bodies, and they were a real large company, and that's what they did. And we kind of solved that mystery. We did it in one of the newsletters a long time ago. And just one of the anomalies of this whole company, this whole move and everything else. So basically by 1923, Checker was in place. And one of the ones there's a lot of falsehoods out here and a lot of misinformation. And one of them is, there's this stuff you read in a lot of magazines. In fact, Dick just brought it up. Morris Markin ran from Chicago to Kalamazoo. He was driven out because of the taxi cab wars. His house was bombed, and he ran with his tail between his legs to Kalamazoo because he thought the gangsters in Chicago were going to kill him. And the evil guy behind it was John Daniel Hertz, who was the owner of the arch rival of Checker, Yellow Cab Manufacturing. John Hertz is known as the guy, if you see today, it's Hertz Equipment Rental. They rent bulldozers and backhoes. It's also Hertz Penske Truck Rentals, and it was Hertz Car Rental. He got his start in Chicago as well, making a car. He started in 1915 making yellow cabs, and he actually manufactured them. He had companies called Yellow Cab. That's where the term Yellow Cab comes. These are all were franchises throughout the country that bought cars from him, and they got a franchise. This is why I think that's a bunch of crap. What happened was this. Morris Markin's house, I believe, was bombed in 1922 in Chicago. In 1922, they didn't have very much going on. John Daniel Hertz, first of all, was operating a livery service under Shaw in Chicago from like 1907. He was manufacturing his own cabs in 1915 in Chicago, actually making his own cabs. He was a huge company by 1922. Markin had just really started making his own cabs. He just started. And he wasn't really a threat, because in those days, purpose-built cabs, these specially made cabs, there was probably 20 brands throughout the country. You had Dodge, you had Pennant, you had all these different brands that were being produced. You had Elcar that were being produced, and it just didn't quite make sense. They were just starting to develop. If there was a taxi cab war in Chicago in 1928, where Yellow and Checker went at it, but at that time, Hertz was pretty much out of the picture. What I find odd too, in 1925, Hertz sold out Yellow Cab manufacturing to General Motors. They actually merged. And then they kept it till 28 in Chicago. They moved it to Pontiac, Michigan. It became a division of GM Coach and bus, bus and truck. Also, Markin never moved out of Chicago. From what I gather, he had multiple residences. He didn't run to Chicago. He lived in Chicago. He lived in hotels and apartments and at houses in New York. And to my knowledge, I might be wrong on this, but I don't believe he moved to Kalamazoo until 1943. So if he was running, he sure took his time running. I think, basically, I think, to get over that, the Hertz marketing thing, Hertz turned out to be a really big player. And there was that rumor that, and a lot of this stuff really sounds romantic. With the Al Capone was involved, and all of this, the E-bomb. Hertz hired Al Capone, Hertz hired some thugs to bomb Markin's house, and Markin retaliated years later by burning down his house and killing his prize racehorses. And I just don't think it washed, because, like I say, at that time, Hertz was much bigger than Checker was. Checker was just in its infancy. Yellow was a huge company. Yellow was selling so many franchises. They were selling around the world. They ran the name. They couldn't even use the name anymore in cities. So they got into black and white. They got into red top. They were selling cars. They got into trip buses. They started buying out bus companies. They bought out so much. That's why General Motors wanted to buy it. And that was only a few years later. So, Checker was in its infancy. They were basically in some tiny place in Joliet. They just moved to Kalamazoo. They were in a big mess. And at that time, they weren't owning any cabs. Even with other thing too, Hertz was starting to get out of, by that time, owning operating companies, manufacturer. He was really giving up. He didn't like running different cab companies in different cities. He basically started, I want out of this. I want to be a manufacturer. That guy moved up the ladder so fast. Here's a guy who started as a boxer in Chicago, and he ended up later on, Schuson Lehman, one of the major principals over there, he ended up big an officer in TWA. This guy went on and on and on. He went into the big leagues, owning a Triple Crown horse winner. He was a serious player. There was a fallacy. There was something called, you can read this in a lot of magazines, you can read it in a lot of other stuff. In New York City, this is the Checker. Looks like an E. In the early days, there were 3-door cars. This door was missing because guys used to hide here in New York City and mug the people coming out at night. So they had to leave this open so when the customers came in, they could see that no one was hiding here. This is what's wrong with this picture. When cabs evolved, the first cabs that came to this country only had 2 doors. You had no door here and no door. This was open. The drivers basically sat out in the front. People didn't care about drivers in those days. They cared about customers. Customers sat in the back. Those were pretty much a standard New York City thing. That came in from the first French cabs that reported in New York in 1907. What happened was the drivers started complaining, hey, it's cold out there, it's raining out there. I don't like the snow and ice. I count too. Okay, we're going to give you a roof. Then we're going to give you a door on the other side. Also, what a lot of people don't realize is trunks per se weren't really invented until the mid-30s. Where do you put the luggage? Got no room back here because there was no trunk, hadn't been invented yet. How about here? Another thing too, in these days, in New York City, there were up to 4 different rates. When you held a cab, it wasn't like today, it's $2 for a cab. There were 4 different rates going on. How did you tell? If you didn't see this sign, you couldn't always see it. The cab's coming down the block at you. The meter was right here. It sat on a pole, like a barber pole. And how you told? They were different colors. There were 4 different colors. That's how you told how much the cab was. So if you knew the color, you could also see what was going on. So the reason this was kept open, there was nobody hiding in here to mug anybody. It was like, you put your luggage here, because there was no trunk, you can see what's going on with the meter, and you gotta protect the driver. So, if you ever read down in one of these articles, somebody writes about Checker, about the famous 3-door New York cars, where the muggers hide it, I think you might know now what was really going on. When you go into, there's a common misconception that in 1959, private cars built by Checker first came out in 1959 with the advent of the Superba. Everybody believes that that's when they really got serious, that's when they made. Before that, they just made cab. What happened was, the first car that they came out with was right here. This was the Goodspeed. This was the car that I was telling you about earlier. That in 1922, they came out with this car and bankrupted Checker. This is not a taxi cab. And before that, they were building Commonwealth cars. This is the first real Superba, you know, right here. And from that point, there was an awful lot of private cars that came in. There was also, supposedly an E-model too. There were two, in 1924, when they came out with the E-model, there were two different E-models. There was a Landau and there was a limousine. Now, the one listed in the limousine was, I'm not sure it was, but I have a feeling because it was listed as a limousine, there might have been some sold as limousine. That's amazing. But I want to go into the next car. That's this one right here. In 1926, this car right here came out. It was a Roadster. And on the side, it says Automobile Blue Book's official car, built by Checker Cab Manufacturing. Blue Book was kind of like what AAA does today. They went around the country and they rated things. They went around and rated hotels, they did this, they had a series of these cars. Talking to someone today, he was telling me they had a photo of Morris Mark and his wife in this car. And where it was made, who was where it was made, not much is known about it. But you have to think about something. They made cars. They owned the Dort, they had the Dort Auto Body Company here in Kalamazoo. If a guy could make a taxi body, he could make this. There's no brochures on them, we don't have anything. They were making these cars. The next car that I think a lot of you have seen is, let's go into this one. In fact, Jim Garrison just gave me this photo today. I know one thing, I don't think it's a cab. It's a 1921 K model. It doesn't look like a cab. It's artillery wheels. Artillery wheels were generally not used on Checkers. They had the solid disc wheels. Looks like somebody was using that as a cab. Most K, there were some that he sold in Philadelphia, but most of the Ks were open. They're called town cars. They're open cars. So that's another photo of an individual produced car. Then you have the car Sam Insel. Sam Insel was the protege of Thomas Edison, who got involved in some kind of security scams with the utility business, and apparently had a lot of enemies because he needed a bulletproof car. That's a check around. This is produced for him, and in Chicago, for him to drive around in, so his enemies wouldn't get him. But Checker was making these, another example of an individual car. Now the next individual car that I kind of dug up, and actually was a car that's used a lot. In 1931, Checker was in when it had a depression. And I guess they were getting debt to make other types of things. And this actually came a little later. And this is another false, this is on 36 here. But that's a Checker T. But what happened was they made a version of this. It was called the Utility. It's sometimes wrongly called a Suburban, but it's called the Utility. It was what you call a Suburban today. It was actually an individual car. It was more of a station wagon. They made 1,000 of these. They made them from the M version into the T version. And this stretch version, not too many people know anything about, including myself. Now, we don't know what it was. we don't know if it was a professional car, we don't know if it was an aerobus type of car or a panel truck. It could have been actually any of those above. Because even in the professional car field, they were using multiple use cars. Just the depression, there wasn't a lot of money. If you were a small funeral home, you had to use it as an ambulance, you had to use it as a hearse, you had to use it as a first call car. You had to do all kinds of things with it. But the actual suburban utility was used as kind of first it was advertised as like a station wagon. It was the type of thing you pick up your kids at school, you carry packages. It had 3 rows of seats, and it had a folding tailgate, like the older station wagons in '56, where it actually folds down. And then they came out with this stretch version. So there we go with another car. And I don't have any photos of these cars, but you get into, in the 1940-41 A models, there's going to be one over here at Gilmore tomorrow. There's actually a sedan limo version of an A model Checker. That's the one where the roof went down in the back and all of that. And so I just didn't bring a photo of it. And that was built as a car, a sedan. After World War II, in 1947, when Checker got back into the cab manufacturing again, they made a series of cars from 47 to 54, the A2 to the A6. Those cars, the 2, 4, and 6 versions were taxi cabs. 3, 4, 5 were cars. They were sedans. So they were made as cars. So actually, when 1958 came around and they came out with the first true sedan built for this purpose, Checker probably had a lot of years in the car business. So it wasn't a great revelation that one day, the Martins woke up and said, let's make a car. They've been making sedans for a long time. So that's, and there's a lot of stuff probably been made out there, custom stuff. The next group of cars I want to talk about are the Checker prototype cars. Checker had a lot of extensive manufacturing in the late 30s. They got involved with buses. In World War II, they got involved with all kinds of different specialized equipment they were making. After World War II, this is the first prototype that came out. This car has a rear engine right here, and it had 2 doors, and the other one here, I think it shows the seating. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, that's true. This is how the car was configured. It had an engine in the rear, like a lot of limousines. It had 1 seat facing backward, 1 seat facing forward. And this car was called the B model. The Checker's last car that they made in the beginning of World War II was called the A. And this car supposedly had two problems with it. One, it didn't get the weight, the balance right. It had a heavy engine in the back, and people, as a rule of thumb, don't really like riding it that way. It can make you dizzy, car sick, et cetera, et cetera. And it just didn't maneuver very well. And it was funny because I was just talking to Roy Dickinson before, and he said they did make a couple of them, and they ended up being shop cars. In fact, where they just drove them around. They didn't like throwing them out, and they just kind of used them until he said they ran the wheels off them. Which is something I didn't even know until I learned that tonight. But the car kind of died, and then they came out with a car called a C, which nobody knows anything about, except that there's a record of a car called the C, and it just existed on some drawing board somewhere, and I couldn't find anything more about it. Then they came out with the D, and this is a car that's really interesting. It was way ahead of its time. It was front-wheel drive, had a super short wheelbase, and if you look at it kind of, you notice this kind of looks kind of like a Dodge, look at 40, 50. Dietrich did a lot of work for Chrysler. He did the design on it. And this car was supposed to be like an all-type car. They were supposed to going to make ambulances out of it. They were going to make pickup trucks, limousines, regular sedans, convertibles. They came in like a 7 and 9 passenger. Now these cars are actually used. The one version there was a 7 passenger that they ran for $35,000, and there was a 5 passenger version, a taxi cab. They ran in Racine, Wisconsin. They put $65,000, and it got like rave reviews. I mean, the thing was like all front-wheel drive. It was great in the snow. It had good balance, it had great turning radius. It was short, but apparently, from what this article that I read by Carl Ludwigson and some of the stuff I kind of put together, the car, they just couldn't get their assembly lines going, the demand, I mean, the demand was unbelievable. The A model Checker, I believe it was last made in 1941, were all burned out by 1947. Checker couldn't get their line going. This was a prototype that would have meant changing the line, all kinds of problems. They weren't sure how the operators, what would take to them. At that time, for their own operating company, Checker owned quite a few operating companies throughout the country. Chicago, New York, Minneapolis, I mean Atlantic City, a lot of different places. They were buying cars. They were buying cars from Chrysler because they couldn't keep up with demand. So I think what they did, they just took the shortcut and said, you know what? They came out with the next car, which was an A2, which is basically, it looks really close to this, except it wasn't front-wheel drive. It was a standard. It was rear-wheel drive. The next thing I want to touch upon is aerobuses. Another thing, aerobuses were first introduced in 1961. Checker, in 1961, that's when Checker first made, to my knowledge, their own real aerobus that they marketed after they came out with the Superba wagon. This is an aerobus Checker had basically made. It wasn't the first real aerobus. The 1935Y series that they made, and I'm not sure whether Checker made it or who made it. I know this one was made by Armbruster Stageway in Fort Smith, Arkansas. They're coach builders, and what their specialty was stretching cars. They're an old company, founded in 1889. They went out of business in the 90s. But these guys stretched anything. If anybody rode any airport limousines to any cities back in the 60s and 70s, these guys stretched everything. They stretched Chryslers, they stretched Chevy, they stretched Suburbans, they stretched, you name it, these guys stretched it.
They used to have it for a passenger Newport.
The Newports were real big. And with these guys, they did this Checker-owned Parmalee systems, and these guys, here's a stretch. I don't know what it was, an 8.2 or something. This is the one, you know, that they stretched, and they did. There was also one they did a Y. It was a 6-door version. It was a sedan version with a trunk that the Checker used. Also, Parmalee used in Chicago for their system there. There was also a version that Armbruster did of an 8-door A8, and it came in with the 8-door A8. This was an export version. They had a ladder out the back, and they had a roof rack, and they were used, I know they were used in Turkey, but the only problem with them was that they couldn't be used for American highways. They were too underpowered. At that time, you had the Continental, 226 engine. The basic flathead version was 89 horsepower. In the A8, they really didn't have very much in transmissions then. You had a 2-speed automatic, or you had a 3-speed on the floor. You had a very underpowered car, a very heavy car. It could probably only be used on back roads where speed didn't matter. So those cars were used. A lot of articles also say that a lot of the aerobuses started in the 50s. the only Airbuses that started in the 50s was the arm-boosted version. And this. Now, this is for Checker's own use, and then the Y model is for Checker's own use. The arm-booster was for stage, was for export. So basically, you know, the car wasn't really produced by Checker until 1961, where they did their own car. They did their chassis. Nobody stretched anything. Nobody built anything. Nobody did anything for them. Okay. Everybody's seen the Metacar. That's the Checker E version with the 129-inch wheelbase with the big roof, with the handicap produced car. So they were made in 1969 for 1 year. However, right here, this is 1957. This is yellow cab in Philadelphia. These cars were semi-Metacars. They were the Cabulant yellow cab in Philadelphia from around 1937 was using stretched Plymouths to do what they were doing. Rather than type an ambulance, it was really destined for emergency work. If you had a handicapped person had to go back and forth, use a Checker. So what they did, by now, I was told by mechanics who worked for Checker in Long Island City that these were converted in New York. Basically, the interior was taken out, bucket seat was put in, plywood was put on the floor with linoleum, and they were fitted, retrofitted for someone to put whoever, a stretcher or a wheelchair in there. And that was as early on the AA as 1957. Because what happened, Chrysler got out of the stretched car business when they lost the cabs in New York City. In 1954, they really didn't make stretched DeSotos or Dodges or Plymouths anymore. So Yellow Cab in Philadelphia had quite a business going in handicapped transportation. They went with these cars. So this is really the first Metacar. And this kept going until, you know, we get into 1969, and then they actually had the, there's the standard Metacar, you know, as we know it. It had the extra high door, it had the extra high roof, it had the 180-degree swing door, you could have ramps, you could do this, it had to do with wheelchair, stretcher, high roof, they just didn't make a lot, and they lasted 1 year. However, that doesn't mean this ended. And it didn't really end until the very end, because there were many, many E's, because he came out in '63 with the extra 9-inch door. People could retrofit these, and I've seen many, many of them at different shows, and people I know have owned them. This went on until the very end. They had a 180-degree door. They didn't have the roof height. And you could just put a ramp, you could carry, you could modify. So the car didn't really end in 1969. It went on until the very end of the Checker. Now, Ben Merkel gave me this photo yesterday. What year was this, Ben?
That's like a 1980 model.
Yeah. This is what, Vancouver? Yeah. This is a cab. Somebody decided to make their own Metacar. And they had supposedly, what, 8 of these?
8 to 10 of them.
8 to 10 of these. So these existed in a different version. So, I mean, this is the kind of stuff, you know, that keeps coming up. You know, when people say specific things, like, oh, Metacars were only made for 1 year, you know, it kind of gets on and on. Now, I'm just somebody, this is Patrick Martin. If you stand up, he just wrote an article, Professional Cars, about, he did a lot of research, been working on it a long time, and even brought to my attention stuff I wasn't aware of. You know, I've worked with him on the articles, the American stuff. He did a lot of research on cars in Sweden, and apparently there was a huge medical car business in Sweden. There was a Checker dealer in Sweden who seemed to sell as many Checkers as they sold in this country. This guy, Patrick Seaton, and he seemed to work with this coach builder called Heinels, and they made, and Patrick, correct me if I'm any wrong, I'm not an ambulance guy. You are. This is the stuff that they were putting out in Sweden. They were taking cars and making ambulances out of them. And they came in various forms. Some just were basic, that's a hearse. I didn't make it. But this apparently had some jump seats in it, with ball bearers, stretch car, and that's one of the hearses they produced over there. Here's another version of a checker ambulance with a raised roof, and this one I know a lot of people have seen. So this is the one. This is produced by DeGiorgi in Switzerland. They made supposedly 3 of these in 1966. It was on a stretched Aerobus chassis, and then it was cut back down apparently. But I guess you can see all the work these guys. It's been a really expensive.
That windshield.
It's a windshield. Plus the house cost. No. But I mean, also, you know, in 1966, I don't have the literature with me, but Checker actually tried marketing an ambulance in this country. There was one they apparently made that they tried to market, and apparently they tested the waters, and they didn't really go anywhere with it. In 1933, the board of Checker seemed to want to get rid of Morris Markin for some reason. They wanted to remove him from his place. And I guess they weren't too happy with the performance that was going on, the depression was going on, they weren't selling enough cars. They wanted him removed. Eric Logancourt, responsible for Ford, Auburn, Duesenberg, I guess he was involved with this, all of this, came in, stepped in, threw a bunch of cash. Markin had stock options. He ended up back in control of Checker. And where did this connection come from? Where all this? This is where I basically come up with. Apparently, there was some previous connection between Cord and Markin that goes back to the 20s with some investment groups and things like that. But in 1932, when the T-model Checker came out, it used a light-combing engine. Light-combing engines were manufactured by Cord. At that time, Checker was using Buda engines. They kicked over to light-combing as a straight 8-cylinder engine. They started producing this car. It was basically this car. And they were chummy that way. They were buying engines from them. Cord stepped in from that point on. That was the engine of Checker, basically. Also, there was a company that Cord owned in Cleveland called Safety Cab. Safety Cab started around 1925. Safety Cab sold cars in Cleveland, New York. It was one of the cars that they manufactured. Guess what? When Checker took over, all of a sudden safety cabs were made by Checker. And another thing interesting, there was a fellow that used to work for Checker named DeWeese, who stepped down from being plant manager here, or one of the head honchos in Kalamazoo, and he appeared in Cleveland as head of safety cab right after that. So there was a big connection, and they made these cars for 2 years, 33, 34, 35. They made the safety cab. And what was, one of the distinguishing was this grill. Safety cabs had other things on them. They had a lot of fancy pinstriping. They had safety cab written on them, but they basically was a Checker T. Now, I was doing some research with Harry Boyd, and we're looking at this picture. There's something wrong with this picture. In the picture, it says it's got all this safety cabs had, but guess what? It's not a safety cab. It's a Checker. We put another picture back. Right here. Yellow Taxi Company of New York City, part of the Parmalee system. There is no safety cab written on it. You can see here, here's the grill. What actually that grill was, it wasn't the only identifying factor of the safety cab. It was an option. You could get that grill on a checker, or you could get that grill on a safety cab. So it was an either-or situation. I mean, that's one connection. In somewhere in Markin started buying the stock back in 1935, without getting into the whole financial analysis and all sorts of. There was a lot of investigations by the Securities and Exchange Commission towards Cord, towards Markin, towards a bunch of stuff. What basically happened is this: without going into any of that and boring everyone to death, Markin got Checker back for himself. Cord went off to his own way, and what another kind of fallacies out there that you read a lot in a lot of these stories that, well, Cord got tired of owning Checker and retired. Cord did not retire. Cord was forced out of Auburn. He was forced out by a group of investment bankers led by Daniel Hertz and Rockefeller and our good friend Hertz again, and an investment banker in New York called Victor Emanuel. Cord went on to make all kinds of things like refrigerators in the factory and kitchen cabinets. And Cord didn't go anywhere. He got $2.5 million for his company. He went to California, bought tons of real estate in Beverly Hills, and became even richer. He became a politician in Nevada. The guy went on and on and on and on. He didn't retire at all, and it's another, kind of fallacy that, sounded good. He just retired and went off into the sunset. We'll touch on buses, Checker buses. I just, a lot of people just don't know. I did write an article a while back on buses, and I just want to kind of go over it, just a little bit quickly. And there was a connection, which a lot of people don't get early. Checker buses were really founded by Ford. This here is basically a moving van chassis. It's a little bit modified, but Ford came out with a cheap engine, powerful engine, and a light, long wheelbase vehicle that they sold. And what was happening is converters were buying them, putting the V8, putting a cab forward control system on, and building a bus body. And Ford decided they didn't want anyone doing it, they were going to do their own. They got involved with Union City Body Company from Indiana. They were building this. Somewhere in World War II, most of these were sold to Detroit Street Railways. And they seemed to like these small buses. And
Small buses on short headways.
yeah. So what happened is they came out with this. They eventually turned it more into a real bus. They put a rear engine in it. They ended up with better electrical systems and this and this and this. And actually, in 1941, they decided they were going to form their own bus company, manufacturing company. This wasn't going to be a type of Ford. It was going to be called Transit Buses Incorporated. And they actually formed the company. Now World War II was going on. People were gas rationed. People didn't have cars. People were working all kinds of shift work in factories. Demand on buses went crazy. Bus sales went to the roof. Military needed buses. They were selling these buses left and right. All of a sudden, comes the end of World War II. Buses aren't in so much demand. People need cars. Ford's not interested. Ford's trying to make cars. 47 comes along. Don't really understand whether the tail was wagging the dog or what was happening. Checker comes in and really is hired by transit buses to make buses for them. And they go off and go on and like do their thing. And they were using the Ford. I'm not sure. It's just something that a lot of mystery goes on, but what happened, Checker became the owner that I know in 1950 of transit buses. The connection before that, who was working for who, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure if who was doing what to who. But they ended up with basically this was Checker bus, and they really had a 28 seat and a 40 seat configuration. But what happened is some of these people didn't have this door. They didn't have this door. They could seat more. Like in this, really, it was the 28 seat was without with the door. You could get 32 people in it. It didn't have that door. And again, these were sold in mostly Detroit Street Railways. But however, there's been a lot of other connections. I mean, I've heard they've been in Jersey. There was a company on Long Island called Checker Buses, and they actually ran these buses in Nassau County on Long Island. And it's some of my incomplete information. I haven't finished the research on it yet. But here's their larger bus. This had a 540-inch Leroy engine, a big job. And then right after that, and the other one had a Continental. The other one had a 330-inch overhead Continental engine. And they sold, I don't know, maybe a couple thousand of them, something like that. And they were actually good-looking bus, a high-end bus. But from what I gathered, there was a lot of other strong players in the bus business. General Motors had the diesel, and they didn't have a diesel. I mean, there was flexible. There's all kinds of different.
Yellow coach.
Yellow, yeah. But you know, at that point, it was basically GM bus or 50. Yellow coach was kind of out of a lot of. And you know, you had all these people in the bus business, and the transit industry was basically dying at this point. I mean, cars were coming in, superhighways were coming, inner cities were like closing down a lot. The bus business was not. I mean, if you go back to Hertz again, he dumped his bus interests at that point. He went on to rent the cars in those days. He got rent cars going. In 53, when he started back up in the 20s, he sold to General Motors, he bought it back in the 50s again. He dumped this whole transit bus thing. Actually back to GM. He really knew how to sell the losers to GM. Every time he sold something to GM, it failed. I mean, it was like yellow. And you know, going off of that, and I don't have any pictures for this, there's another thing that you sometimes use in this information. That in the 30s, General Motors wanted to put Checker out of business. And they came into New York City with a car that they produced, which was, it was basically what Yellow had evolved into. It was a General, it was called a General. So what happened there was that also is like a bunch of garbage. Because what happened, Yellow was founded by John Hertz in 1915. In 1925, he merged with General Motors. They were in the business in 1925. What happened in the 30s, you had the Depression, nobody was selling cars. And what Markin started to do in the late 20s was buy up operating companies. He bought out Parmalee, they bought out Yellow. I mean, in New York, you had Motor Care Transportation, you had Hamilton Peters, and these all developed. He owned thousands and thousands of cars. So what General did, when they bought out Parmalee was part of Yellow. That was also part of Hertz's empire. They were buying their own cars. When Markin bought him out, he's not going to buy General Motors cars. He's going to buy Checkers. So he proceeded to buy Checkers, and they said, wait a minute, we got to get back in the mix. They tried to sell the company to Mark, and he didn't really want it. He hoped they would just go away. They're General Motors, they just don't go away. So they came in and they did some things. You could buy a General for $300 down and all this, and then they bought the rights to Grand Central Terminal and Penn Station, and they had the rights to put the cars there, and they did this and they did that. And it wasn't that they tried to really put Markin out of business. What they really did was just follow suit. In those days, that's what he did. He was owning operating companies. They wanted to own operating companies, and they failed terribly. There was this kind of rumor that, oh, they sold these cars, the guys put $360 down, they drove the car for 2 months, the tires fell off, they gave the cars back to General Motors, they all bought Checker. That's a bunch of crap. There were 25 different cars being sold in New York City at that time. They didn't run to buy Checkers, they bought all kinds of stuff. And there were Luxors, and there were Paramonts, and 4 million other cabs out there. So I mean, the thing was, General Motors was trying to take a last shot at doing it. They got out of the operating business in 1935. By 1938, they were gone as a cab. They came back, and they actually stopped making the car in 35. They came back for a couple of years, and that's all that was about. The war between Checker and Chrysler. A lot of people think that Checker was the largest selling car in New York City. You know, if you go to New York City in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you would see Checker. You're going to see anything else. That's all there were. Thousands and thousands of thousands. They were the only cab that was ever driven, and they were all yellow. First of all, they weren't all yellow, but I'm not going to go into that. They didn't really become yellow until 1970. Variations of all that. What happened was, Checker had an engine that wasn't doing too well. It had a Continental engine. And they came out with the Aerobus, they came out with all these different limousines, they had the E model, and these engines just weren't going to do it. But apparently, they thought they could, and they hung on the Continental engine a little too long. They had this unpowered engine. They also got a Teledyne took them over. They got a price increase from Continental. They decided we can't afford this engine. Let's go look for an engine. So they went to Chrysler and says, we want to buy an engine from you, because they thought that was a pretty good market. Chrysler had other plans. They said, yeah, we'll sell you an engine. But Lynn Townsend at that time, who ran Chrysler, says, we're going to kick your ass and drive you out of the cab business. You know, no little crappy company from Kalamazoo is going to tell Chrysler what to do. So they started selling the 326, I think it was a Power Spirit, that engine, to the Aerobuses. But they kept gagging and dragging, and the engines weren't appearing, and Aerobuses couldn't be built, and where's all these Chrysler engines? Well, there are no Chrysler engines, and there are no Aerobuses, and Chrysler just doesn't want to deliver them. So, Checker starts buying Chevy engines. Okay, we're going to put Chevy engines. We need the big engines, you know, the Aerobuses, the limos, cars, modern engine. Continentals are outdated, they're too small, they're this, and this, off we go. Chrysler says, we're not going to sell you engines. We're really going to get you. We're going to get you where it hurts. We're going to get you in the biggest market in the country, which is New York City. In case most people don't know, New York City probably at that time had very close to 12,000 taxi cabs. Most of them, the fleet cars are changed out every year or two. It's a big, big market. It was also a very prestigious market. Chrysler was coming out at that time with the Slant 6, the 318. These are really strong engines, tough. I remember the ads from those days. If it was taxi tough, police tough, race car proven, our stuff was really tough. This is what we want. It was a lot of it was a marketing thing. We're going to show through this that we're going to, you know, if this is in a cab that runs 24 hours a day, you're going to want it in your car. And they really did have, they had some really good stuff going for them. They had a unibody, they had the Slant 6, which was a bulletproof, really tough, cheap little engine that ran forever. And they had the torque flight transmission, which was basically bulletproof. I mean, they were getting into alternators. They were really, really an advanced car. And at that time, also, I believe most taxis didn't have much of a warranty either. So Checker, I mean, Chrysler, to sweeten the pot, says, we're gonna give you a warranty on your cabs. We're gonna warranty 5 years, $50,000, which is unheard of in the cab business. And on top of that, for a few bucks more, you can get a $75,000. And on top of that, they would give you like a $183 rebate on your car. And on top of all of that, if you bought a fleet, they were throwing free engines out, free transmissions, and they trying to say, you know, no little car maker, and they thought they had you. And they said, you guys, like, you're just a small guy, you don't even have your own engine, you don't have anything. We're gonna come, we're gonna kick you down, and we're gonna put you in business. And it started to really show, because in 1962, Checker was still #1 in New York City. There were 4,056 Checkers, and there were 2,376 Dodgers. But the Chrysler thing was starting to grow. The warranty, better cars, this, that. Also, what had happened too, Checker was protected for many years. It was a monopoly in New York City. You had to have limousine-sized cars. Basically, it evolved to, by the early 50s, 3 were left, Packard, Soto, and Checker. And under political pressure and stuff like that, in 1954, actually, I want to mention this date. I think you're leading coincidence. I don't know about this. Date, think of this date, everybody. That's why I want to close with this story. July 12th, 1954. That was the day that New York City said no more limousine cabs. As far as I personally believe, that was the demise of Checker. They didn't have the monopoly there anymore. Statistically, a 5-passenger cab, which Checker was, in the back seat is how they counted passengers, didn't matter. 5-passenger cars were really, statistically, it's like something like 1.3 people, something rides in a cab. There was no need for 5 cars. It was a monopoly. It was thrown back years and years ago, and that's kind of what they had. There wasn't a need for that. When sedan cars came in, they were cheap, a lot less in price, and you could actually, you know, why would you want to buy a 5-passenger car? There was no need for it. That was the day the Checker sales started to suffer and suffer and suffer, because this was the biggest market. Also, the whole purpose built that these special made 5-passenger cars was starting to get out of fashion throughout the whole country. It was just like, we don't need this, and people got used to it. So what? We can get in a car. It's a little tighter. It's a little tougher to get in. So what? We're used to it. This is where we're going. We can sit in a Dodge. We can sit in a Plymouth. We don't need these big cars. What happened was to get crazy, you know, not to get too crazy, rather. Chrysler became stronger and stronger. By 1965, what happened? There were 885 Checkers in New York City. There were 7,261 Dodgers. It was basically over. You know, later on they hung on to some other things.
What date was that again?
1965. So basically it was over. What Checker tried to do though at the time was sue Chrysler for triple damages, for restraint of trade, and there was a lot of common rumor that they won and lost their, well, they didn't win and lost their Chrysler. It was appealed later on, and Checker lost again. They never really liked admitting that, but they lost the lawsuit. Chrysler won, and Chrysler just won completely. And the reason I bring up July 12th is Checker closed their doors on July 12th, 1982. I don't know if those two dates have anything in common with each other, but I just think it's just a very odd coincidence. And with that, you've heard enough out of me.
Hello again, and thank you, Mike, for that fascinating lecture about Checker's illustrious past. The second part of this video shows the old Checker cars that were at the Checker Car Club's national meet in June of 2002. The gathering was held at the Gilmore Classic Car Museum in Hickory Corners, Michigan, which is just northeast of Kalamazoo. As most of us are aware, old Checker cars are extremely rare. As taxi cabs, they had little popular interest, and when they were finished with rough service, they were nearly all scrapped out. As mentioned, this was the first time that the old Checker cars had ever been gathered together in one place. The cars at this show represent the best of what is still left. There are some unrestored Checkers, and hopefully a few still waiting to be discovered. If anybody hears about any old Checker cars that aren't on our short list, please let us know. These are the Checker cars that took us through the streets of America's great cities for 60 years. What a trip it was. This is the great granddaddy Checker of all. This is the 1923 Model H. This is what started off the Checker Motor Corporation. Checker was in Joliet, Illinois at the time, and then they began looking for another factory. They came to Kalamazoo in 1923 and bought out the Handley Knight plant. And that's where Morris Martin started his production of cars just like this. This one, I believe, was made at the Checker factory. This particular car, they started out using Buda engine. The Buda 4-cylinder engine is in this. It is not one of the most powerful things a person ever rode in, but it's sufficient to the time. It was rugged, reliable, and got the job done, easy to maintain. They used the Buda 4s up until 1928, when in the Model Ks they switched over to the Buda 6 engine. And that, of course, just offered that much more power and performance and made it easier for them to get around. This few interesting features. Notice that there's no window here. The cabbies actually were sat outside in the weather. The transportation was geared towards the customer, and they made it comfortable for them back here. It was rather nice and plush. They had places for flowers or lamps, whatever they were looking for at night. It might be something to be able to read in the back there. But the cabbie was just the poor guy out there in the weather, in the elements, driving the vehicle. And it's certainly a simple instrument panel. There's just the...
There were two H models, the H1 and the H2. The H1 was manufactured in Joliet, and when Checker moved to Kalamazoo, those models were designated the H2. If you notice the meter and the area under it, first of all, the meter was a wind-up meter. Every time every so often they had to wind the meter up to keep it going. And that's just the way it was. And then it was hooked into the speedometer, et cetera, to measure the miles and the time and all of that. But under this meter also was a luggage compartment. And that's where the luggage was kept. Cars of this era didn't have a trunk. Trunks really didn't exist in cabs or any car for that matter, really until somewhere in the 30s, where they're actually built into the sheet metal of the car. It was either a luggage rack behind or an actual trunk itself was put on the back of the car. And this particular model car, the passenger door, when it was open, in that area, there was an area for luggage. In real busy cities such as Chicago and New York, the door was removed and this was left open because of the high volume of traffic. And this is where the luggage was kept. What's interesting to note also is that these Ulmer wind-up meters were actually used by some cab companies up until the 60s. Meters really didn't change that much other than being electrically powered. The real change in meters came in the 80s when they became electronic. You notice on the rear of the car there seems to be louvers over the rear passenger window. They weren't louvers at all, they're actually privacy panels. The car got ventilation from another source, but these were actually designed in the days when ladies were ladies and didn't like to be looked at, and people valued their privacy. So they're actually privacy panels that were there to keep the people in the street from like staring in through the windows to observing the passengers.
At the Imperial Palace auction in Las Vegas in 1987, April 12th. We started at my shop in Atlantic, Connecticut, a yellow cab from the garage, and it was in fairly bad shape. And we replaced all the wood with new oak from Legend, Connecticut sawmill. And it was painted there, posted in my upholstery shop. And about it's an old movie car, like a theater movie with cars embedded. I've seen it in the Lynn Miller story. Shot at Lynn Miller getting out of it. And I've seen it in a couple of other movies. I can't recall, but when it was on TV, you just see the shot of the interior, or a shot of the door, or a little piece of it. I can recognize it. Wow. But my family's been in the taxi business since 1918, and my daughter's still running the company now. Wow. So that's about it. Anything else you need, let me know. Checker. They have all the checker, whatever you want to call it, throughout the car. And the little checker designs everywhere. Well, they didn't come with the car. There were a couple of universal lights on, round ones. And I had it at a show in Norwich, Connecticut, after we first saw it. And my mechanic was showing the car. He went to lunch. He came back and there was a note on the windshield. And somebody from upstate New York and said, "You have the wrong headlights on this car, and I have a set, and they're for sale." So he left the number, and I called him. I went up 2 days later and flipped his lights. And that finished it up, because it did look foolish without putting lights.
If you notice, the front tops of the front fenders are cut out. This is kind of a checker feature through the later models T, Y, and even into the A. When cars got into accidents, and taxis got into a lot of accidents, specifically front-end accidents, the front fenders were always hit. Checker's thinking was, if the fender was cut off high, basically the fender would be avoided a lot in the collision, and only the tire would get hit. And perhaps the bumper would have to be changed, but you didn't have to hit the fender. And also, the fender would cause a lot more damage. It would cut the tire, it would do this and this when it was damaged. So that was Checker's thinking in cabs for quite some time. Leather was always used on the early cabs until vinyl came out in the 40s. The only way a car could truly be cleaned was by using leather seats. If you use mohair at the time, stains and people spilling things or people getting sick in the car would not be able to be cleaned as well. And certain cities also had certain rules and regulations where cars had to be hosed out daily and cleaned daily. So leather was basically the item of the day, even though it was quite expensive.
This is another relic from the past. This is the 1931 Checker Model M that belongs to my brother and I. We found this in Howard City, Michigan, and it didn't take long for us to feel the history of this vehicle. This had been through the war, quite literally. It didn't serve in the war. It served as a farm truck. This Model M is similar to the beautiful example that was seen earlier, but this has led a different life. It started out as a Chicago taxi cab, but then during the pre-war years, when trucks were being manufactured only for military use, it was necessary for farmers to find vehicles that could be converted into trucks. They had to have ways to haul their goods to the markets. So this is the fate of this vehicle. In fact, it was the saving grace of this vehicle, because so many checkers as taxi cabs were, of course, brought to the scrapyard as soon as they were done with service. This one continued to service as a truck. That was the only reason that it stayed around. It has a Buddha 6 engine, which we'll be able to take a closer look at later. And it has all the features of that Model M, including almost no room for a person up in front. I don't know how a 6-foot-tall person could have driven a vehicle like this. It must have been cramped. But there were probably plenty of 6-foot-tall caddies in Chicago. The rear wheels were changed. They put 20-inch wheels on the back instead of the 16s that were on the front, which gave it a better gear ratio. You could go a little bit faster. The top speed for an awful lot of the Model M's was about 40 miles per hour, and if a person had to go very far to bring in their produce, it would take them a long time. Adding the larger wheels that helped that out a lot. This is going to need a lot of attention. Most of the wood, I can peel a piece off right here, is pretty rotten. We replaced this just so that we could hang the doors back in place. And you can imagine that it takes a fair bit of vision to actually see this in its restored condition, but that's what my brother and I are looking forward to doing. And someday, perhaps after retirement, we'll make it. And we intend to keep this as a truck. It's been suggested that we try to restore this back to a taxi cab. That may even someday be. But for now, it's our intention to leave it as a truck. As I said, that is the fate of this vehicle, and we think that we'll be true to that by keeping it as a truck.
Truck conversions were real popular in the 20s and 30s. The Depression caused a lot of hard times, and people just didn't have money to buy new trucks. There were plenty of taxi cabs available at cheap prices, and also Checker actually made some. They actually had so many trade-ins with their Model Ks that they converted a lot of them to delivery vans. And this particular truck, an M, was the type of truck that was converted by many people. Cab companies also used them a lot. What they did is there were a lot of cars that had rear-end damage, and they could take these cars out and turn them into a wrecker or turn them into a flatbed for use around the fleet. And this was a real popular way to do things, especially when cash was tight in the Depression.
This is a 1933 Checker Model T. It followed the Model M. But part of the difference between the Model M's and the T's was that during that time period, Morris Markin was working with E.L. Cord. Cord Corporation, of course, made Lycoming engines. The Lycoming engines offered the advantage over the old Buddha engines, which were underpowered and unable to keep up good speeds. The Lycoming engines, on the other hand, had a lot of power. They were a straight 8-cylinder engine. That made the cars better able to get around, get there quicker. These were an improvement over the Model M's. This was at the height of the Depression. They were looking to get the common man around where they needed to go. They added additional room in the back compartment for the Model T. There was a tremendous lot of space back there. 4 people could quite comfortably be accommodated in the back of a Model T. They are quite similar to the M's. They still have the cloth top, similar in design. Primary feature that they added was longer in the front end. They went to larger headlights. It's an overall bigger and heavier car. They continued to improve on their models regularly as they went along. Checker was always interested in improvement, and new technology updates, using the best materials and features on their cars. There were hundreds of different taxi cabs being made at that time, narrowing down fast. Checker intended to stay in business, and they've managed to do that by building bigger, better, more usable taxi cabs.
If you notice the top light on this car, there are two orange torches to the left and the right. These are also known as tattletale lights. They serve two purposes. One, at night, if they're lit, it shows people in the street that the car is occupied, especially in city situations where cabs are often flagged down. In other words, if the lights are lit, you wouldn't flag that cab down. If the lights aren't lit, it's a cab you'd want to flag down. It also, at the time, because drivers worked on percentages, it allowed the bosses to see if the driver was stealing from them or not, a practice called high flagging. And he could see if someone was in the car or not. If you notice that there are Landau irons on the roof of this car, in times back, like in the teens and 20s, cabs had them when the actual roofs were made of canvas and folded down like a modern convertible would. But they somehow liked the styling, and they kept the irons on the car, even though this roof was basically a form of a hardtop. If you notice on the dash, most of the instruments were surrounded by the frames of what looks like Checker's logo at the time, which is kind of looked like a policeman's shield. Checker always seemed to incorporate their logo somewhere throughout the car. Unfortunately, the rate sticker of this car seems to be a New York City replica. Wasn't true for the times. That was more the rates of the early 50s. However, this car probably was one of the cars owned by, or was attempted in this restoration to show that it was one of the fleet of National Transportation, more specifically Yellow Taxi of New York, that used these cars pretty much exclusively in their operation in New York City, probably having over 1,000 cars at one time. In some sort of short corporate shuffle, Yellow Taxi was bankrupted in 1935. National Transportation stayed on, but many of these cars went up for sale, and there was a tremendous amount of them for sale at that time. Maybe Checker was just trying to clear the inventory to open it up for the new Y model that they would come out with that year. It's interesting to note about this car is Cord's influence. Cord also manufactured a taxi cab of his own previously called a safety cab. It was manufactured in Cleveland, but he incorporated Checker's much larger manufacturing and better knowledge of taxi cabs, and basically he just rebadged this car as a safety cab, being he did own or had a significant amount of the stock of Checker from like 1933 to 1937.
Yeah, the Checker Model Y was produced from 1935 to 1938, and it had the straight Lycoming 8, which, according to Checker engineer Jim Stout, delivered better fuel economy than the six-cylinder engines they'd used in other cars. The straight 8 probably also gave a lot of good low-end torque for those stoplight drag races in New York and Chicago. But the car had two sunroofs to aid in ventilation, and it had the traditional jump seats, that Checker feature, and it was probably a fairly complicated car to build versus the newer cars that just had a lot of stamped sheet metal. The metal on this car is so thick that you can walk up that fender and it won't budge an inch, not even a millimeter. But don't try that on a car built after World War II, where it'll go. But the car did yeoman service. Many of these were reported to have gone fantastic mileages. By the end of World War II, most of these were pretty well worn out. But the car was built in great numbers, but today there are only 2 or 3 known to exist. 2 for sure, and There's probably a third one waiting to be discovered someplace.
If you notice on the Y, the rear window of the car slid, which is in this an attempt at early ventilation. This car also, in its New York City operation for Parmalee Transportation, another Checker-owned subsidiary, did have an actual sunroof that slid open. This particular car doesn't have it, but that was real popular at the time, again for the tourist industry. People could look up and see the sky. If you notice how long the hood is on this car, that's because it had a straight 8 engine. It was the largest engine that Checker had ever used. And prior to that, they were using 4 and 6-cylinder engines. And to use a straight 8, you needed a pretty long hood.
Stout told me how he designed how Checker cars were designed before the war. He said, you know, he was a tailor. He could look at you and lay out the patterns for a suit for you that would fit you. And he would have us draw on the chalkboard